Hello and welcome to the Tron Church Talking Points podcast. My name is Fraser and I'm here today with Willie, just the two of us here this week. But we're here to just discuss the sermons which we heard together on Sunday. In the morning, we had Josh preaching for us, just coming towards the end of Luke's Gospel in that section from verse 36 through to 49. And in the evening, we were back in the book of James, the beginning of chapter 2. But we're going to begin by just thinking about Josh's sermon on Luke. And Josh began actually with this question or this idea of what our big vision is. He came back to it a number of times. What are we saved for? What does it? What does the Christian life look like? What are our priorities? And also thinking about that as a church. So, I just wondered if, we could maybe speak about that for a little while. What is our vision as a church? A couple of years ago, I think we sort of crystallized it and did a bit of thinking about that. Why is that a helpful thing to do, maybe to begin with, and what are our priorities?
Yeah, I think it is important, isn't it, to keep our vision in front of us all the time. Otherwise, we don't know what we're living for. And I think the Bible does that because it's a forward-looking and a future-oriented message. It's always pointing us to the future. From the very beginning, it's been pointing forward, and it's still pointing forward. Although we look back to, in one sense, the great climax of the Bible story in the coming, in the birth and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. But we still look forward to the consummation. And so, the whole New Testament, all the letters in the New Testament, are pointing us forward all the time to what is still to come, what is still to be fulfilled. Which is the consummation of the kingdom of our Lord Jesus when he comes again. And so that's where we need our vision to be focused all the time. That's where everything's going. That's what everything's for. And so we have a vision statement that focuses on that. I won't give you the whole thing, but I like to just remember the simple truncated version, which is Christ reigning with his people forever. That's where the Bible ends. That's where the real story begins. C.S. Lewis so often is so great in this, isn't he? In the very end of the last of the Narnia books, he talks about it being just the end of the beginning and the beginning of the real story, which never ends, and that's the new Narnia. And that's right, because the real story is the eternal one, and it's only just beginning, and it hasn't properly begun in that sense until then. So Christ reigning with his people forever, that's where the Bible leaves us, and that's where we're going. And so if we live with that as the clear vision of where it is all going and where we're going and what it's all for, then the natural question that follows from that is, well, what should we be doing now in the light of that? And I think the answer that the Bible gives us is that because Christ will be reigning with his people forever, our purpose now as the church is being part of the story of Christ gathering those people together now for that future. That's what we're on earth for. That's why we're here until that great consummation. So those two things, the vision of what's ahead, and therefore the priority for what is now, I think is something that we just need to have in front of us all the time as a church, but also in our own personal Christian lives.
Yeah, no, I've heard it illustrated before with, someone talking about when you're walking up a Monroe or something, and you're going up this hill and you're struggling, and actually, if you don't keep your eyes on up ahead, you can just get bogged down. And if your eyes are always down, and okay, maybe there's sometimes you're going up a particularly tricky bit, and you just need to take it one step at a time, but actually, both looking back and saying, oh, actually, we've come quite a long way already, but also keeping your eyes on where you're going helps you to get forward.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the problem in Scotland, of course, is that you look ahead and all you see is fog and cloud.
Rain, yeah.
So you can't see anything.
But on the one day a year where it's clear, if you happen to be able to that day.
But that is actually a bit like life, isn't it? Because very often, we are clouded in the reality of what we see. And that is why life has to be punctuated with the regular coming together to sort of part the clouds and get a glimpse of the glorious summit. And in a very real sense, that's what we're doing week by week as we gather as the church, isn't it? We're having a foretaste of what is the reality. We're seeing again a bit more clearly what it's all about. And that's why whenever we open the scriptures, it points us to the glory of the summit, so that when the clouds descend a bit again, well, we know it's there. It's in our mind and hearts, and we know that we're going towards that, and it gives us energy for the meantime.
Yeah, and you do need that, don't you? Because otherwise it'd be so easy. If this life was all that there is, you could just you would just be bogged down completely, and we just need that continual reminder. And
Well, the problem is that it's not just that there's clouds of confusion. It's like there's relentless rain and hail of the most miserable propaganda raining down on us relentlessly from every angle, in the media, in the news media, in the social media, in advertising and everything else. And we're much, much, much more affected by that than we realize. And we just have to be realistic about that. That which we are exposed to for the most time will have the most influence on us. And so that's why I urge Christians, stop watching the news, stop being propagandized all the time. Read what's going on in the world through the light of what Scripture teaches you, and give much more attention to that than to these other things, because otherwise, inevitably, your mind will be taken in the wrong directions, and it will be fed falsehood. But falsehood doesn't encourage; it depresses us, or it deludes us.
Yeah, and Josh spoke about this as well. Is that it's the Bible which gives us that impetus for mission. It's the content of the message, but it's also that which gives us the impetus and the real desire, because it would be wrong to think, oh, well, we're faced with this hail and the wind blowing us back in the wrong direction, and so let's just batten down the hatches and, lay low, not cause any trouble, and just wait for that, future reality to come. But the Bible doesn't allow us to do that, because we've got this commission. We've been told, you've got a real role to play in a better vision, and we've got to be reaching out and speaking light into that dark world. Well, you were down in London last week with some of the other guys, and you were at a sort of conference. You were thinking about this question of which Josh raised about, what might the vision for 5 years or 10 years down the line be? You sort of mentioned your draft or jottings at prayer meeting. And I wonder if it might just be helpful to maybe think about that a little bit as well, just in thinking about revision.
I mean, I personally tend to be a little bit allergic to vision statements and goals and all these sorts of things. And I think as Christians, we often are, because we sort of feel, oh, it's a bit worldly. It's we just trust the Lord and get on with it. And in one sense, that's true, because we don't need to work out our own strategy. The Bible gives us a strategy; it tells us, and it's very clear. But actually, we can use all of these things to be too much of an excuse. And when you think about it, when people say, "Oh, we don't want to turn the church into a business," well, we don't want to turn it into a worldly business, but it actually is an eternal business. It's the most important business in the world, isn't it? If we can be enthusiastic about a business that makes, I don't know, iPhones or computers or things that make life better, or whatever you think that is, X-ray scanners or solar panels or diesel engines, which at least work when there's power cuts. The fact of the matter is that our business, the business of the church, is to save people for eternity. So there's no greater business on earth. And if we recognize that, a successful business has to know what it's doing, has to plan where it's trying to go, has to have goals and targets, and actually organize itself in order to produce those, then how much more should we be thinking that for the most important business on earth? And so we constantly have to be asking ourselves, are we actually achieving what we're seeking to achieve? Or, do we even know what we're seeking to achieve? You don't, if you've got an archery competition, you don't just fire your arrow in the air and then somebody runs around with a target and tries to sort of land it. You shoot at the target. I mean, it's fairly obvious, isn't it? So if our target is the Lord gathering as many disciples through us as we can possibly do, then, we ought to at least have some thought and idea about trying to reach that and how we're going to try and do that. So I am persuaded that it's important for us to think in that sort of way. And we look back at a long history as a church. You've got to live in reality. There's things we have as a church that other churches don't have. There's things we can do that others can't do just because of where they are. There's things we can't do that other churches can. We can't be a community church in the middle of a suburb because it's not where we are. And so we have to ask, how can we as a church most effectively use what God has given us? Well, what's God given us? He's given us a long history of a real cherishing of Bible teaching and preaching. He's given us, a long history now of effective structures for training people and thrusting people out into ministry and mission all over the place. And by that, I don't mean people who are paid to work for a church or a mission agency. I mean Christian people who are missionaries wherever they are. And we have the privilege of many students coming through our church for several years at a time. Going back, the 21 years I can remember, we've been actively trying to purposefully train those students and young workers so that when they move on from here and go to, the furthest flung parts of Scotland or the UK or the world, wherever they find themselves in a church, they'll be able to be up and running. They know how to handle the scriptures. They know what ministry is about. They know what Bible teaching is. They know how to go about these things. They know how to organize things. They've been part of a church where they've seen sort of structures that they can emulate and do. And, it's a wonderful thing when we hear from people donkey's years later. You bump into them or you hear from them or whatever it is, and they say, well, I'm in my church. I've been running the youth group now for 10 years. And, I just copied what I saw happening at the Tron. We applied it to our place, and it's different and all of that, of course. So that's one thing that, we have got a unique opportunity that, very few churches do have. There are others, of course, in other cities and other places, but churches like ours ought to be doing that. We ought not to be trying to think, well, we should be like a church in Campbelltown or in, the Isle of Skye or wherever it might be, because we're not. You have an accumulation of experience and of hopefully wisdom and of resources over many years that you become better able to utilize. We just want to be doing that better all the time. We want to have more people who pass through us being sent out into ministry and mission in wherever they end up. But we also want to be seeing more and more people coming to faith among us. And, as we have been, I think in recent years, particularly thinking that through carefully, working out how best to try and put, our time and energies, our resources are limited. We don't have unlimited time or people or money. So we have to make the very best of who we do have and what we do have. And we've certainly found, I think, a combination of really reducing down the number of kind of random things we do, focusing much more clearly on Sunday gatherings and an ancillary like the life course, for example. And we have seen people growing in confidence to see that this is a way that together corporately we can better do evangelism. And we've seen many more people coming to faith. Now, I don't think that is any indication that, we've abandoned the sovereignty of God and we think we're doing it all. It's quite the opposite, actually. It's because we recognize that God is sovereign. We recognize that the mission agency that God has put on earth is called the local church, that we thought, well, why should we try and reinvent or invent something different from that? Perhaps the Lord had some wisdom in what he was doing, and maybe we should have a bit more confidence in that. And I think as folk have grown in confidence in that, we've seen fruit, and the Lord Jesus, puts before us the desire for fruit. When he gives the parable of the sower to encourages people to keep on sowing, even though there'll be hard responses and there'll be superficial responses and there'll be disappointing responses. What he holds before us is that there will be fruit, 30 and 60, 100-fold. And what he's setting before us there is a target, fruitfulness. So you don't just sow seeds for the sake of sowing seeds. You sow seeds because you want to gather fruit. And so, yes, we've been thinking, about what that ought to look like in a more practical sense over the coming sort of 5 or 10 years. You can't in Christian ministry plan 1 year at a time. You can't certainly measure things. Things take time, and it's foolish to think, oh, what do we want to be in 50 years' time? Well, I'll be in the grave in 50 years' time, so that'll be somebody else's issue. That's too far ahead. But 5 to 10 years is not that far away, is it? But we won't be anywhere in 10 years' time if we're not thinking clearly now where we want to be, and that's the issue. And we want to be a church that is growing more people into faith, bringing more people in to know the Lord, training more people and nurturing them in that faith, and dispersing them into wherever the Lord is sending them. And our world is such today that people are so much more mobile. We have people who come here for several years from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Indonesia, from all kinds of countries, and therefore we can be an incubator in that sense for all sorts of parts of the world, places that we don't know much about or have much about. But if I've got a burden in my heart for the gospel in Malaysia, the way that we can actually contribute to that is for Malaysian students who come here and spend some time with us here can learn from what we've got to offer. We've got lots to learn from them as well, of course. But what we have got to offer, if we can give that to them, so that when they go back to Malaysia, that's a much more helpful way, I would suggest, of me helping the church in Malaysia than me going and spending the rest of my life in Malaysia. And I think that's an important thing to think about in terms of when we think about mission, people or missionaries, people often think of that in a very, very narrow way that's sort of 200 years out of date. I mean, I've sometimes spoken about my great-great-great-grandfather, who was one of the very earliest missionaries, the London Missionary Society, to the southern Cape of Africa in 1816. In those days, you set sail and nobody saw you for years and years and years. Nobody heard from you. You went off, you were a pioneer, as he was. He went off, did extraordinary things, left school at 13, translated the whole Bible during his time in Africa, creating the language first, bringing it into writing, teaching people to read and write, and doing that, and for many years, many decades, even centuries, we were a sort of sending hub from a highly Christianized culture to many far-flung parts of the world. But the world is a very, very different place now, and the whole nature of what we mean by that sort of mission is changing, and we've got to be realistic about that. Sometimes I think people think, they'll quote something from the end of Luke about, the gospel begins in Jerusalem and goes out to Judea and Samaria and to the whole world. And we've got to think about that and go out to the whole world. Well, we're not Jerusalem, and we're not the church in the first century. We are the world. And for a time where we live in the Western world, in Britain, in Scotland, we've had a highly, highly privileged history, haven't we, of biblical teaching, not just in the churches, but biblical infusion of the whole culture. But in my lifetime, going before my lifetime, but certainly through my lifetime, we've seen an absolutely rapid de-Christianization, such that, the other week in our prayer meeting, one of our students who'd been away in Chile for the year from Northern Ireland was saying he met somebody there who's training to come as a missionary from Chile to Northern Ireland, and he was a bit shocked, thinking, it should be the other way around. But when he began to think about it, that's the reality, isn't it? Just this week, we've heard the GAFCON, the Anglican Futures Conference, taking over from the Lambeth Conference and basically saying that, sorry, Archbishop of Canterbury, we don't recognize you anymore. We don't recognize the Church of England, the Anglican Church in the Episcopal Church in the States, and so on, basically who've all lost the gospel. And we've been going alongside beside you for years, but sorry, we're pulling the plug. There's essentially the church in Africa and Southeast Asia saying, well, sorry, Western Europe, your day's over. and that's the reality. So the question for us then is, do we give up altogether? Do we say, well, there's no mission for us to do anymore? Or I would say the answer to that is no, although, we need missionaries from other countries coming to us. We've got a Korean couple coming to us now in the church who've just come back from Korea to come here and do ministry here, because they're a far more Christian country than we are. But no, we still have a role. But the question is, what have we got to offer? What have we got to offer to the world, and how can we most effectively do that? And I've been persuaded, and much of my thinking in this has been shaped by our good friend Richard Pratt from Third Millennium Ministries, who developed that ministry with this mindset, a totally realistic mindset. I mean, he would say, for him, it's in America. What have we got in America to give? Well, very little anymore. All we've got is the accumulated wisdom, knowledge, resources from the past. And therefore, our job is to get that out to the rest of the world as much as we possibly can, to the world church. We've got learning, we've got education, we've got all these things from our history. And the fact is that where the church is growing most rapidly in the world, where there is most spiritual life, very often there is the least heritage of teaching materials, training, the inculcation of theological education and so on, that we've had that privilege to. And so I think in a micro scale, in a microcosm as a church, we have to think like that. What have we got? Well, we've got a history, we've got resources, we've got certain expertise in certain things. How can we best offer what we think is of value to other parts of the world? And that's what we try to do. So, for example, we have our I won't name specifically, but we have our contacts in India, North India in particular, one of probably the most unevangelized vast population in the whole world, 500 million unevangelized people, biggest mission field in the world. I personally have a great burden for that, have done through my involvement there for many, many years. But if I were to mistake that and think, well, what that means is the Lord is calling me to leave here and go and live in North India and devote my time there, I think that would achieve very little. What we can do is visit frequently, seek to, as we've done in a number of different ways. Again, I'll not be too specific, but train people there for that work there. And help resource them there, and go on doing that, and go on visiting, and go on training and teaching, and that kind of thing. And I think in numbers of different ways around the world, that's what we're seeking to do, because Pakistani Muslims in Pakistan, if they're going to hear the gospel and be really reached, they're going to be reached by their countrymen, not by you or me and our white faces in the middle of rural Pakistan. Same in most parts of Africa, same in most places in the world. And so the question for us is, how do we, as a church, most effectively contribute to that? Now, it will not just be one way, but it's trying to think about it in the way that's most effective, and trying to plan for that, and not just be random, and be flexible enough to see when the Lord opens particular doors for us, but also be wise enough to say, well, not every open door that seems to be an open door is a wise one for us to go through, because we just may not have that much to offer.
And we can't do everything, but as you say, we can do what we can do, and what we've been given and what we're able to do. And it is really encouraging to think, I'm sure lots of people listening can think about people that have been here and trained with us, and you read it in the notes at the prayer meeting, the list of people who have served with us and are now serving in different countries across the world, as well as different churches in the UK. And there is that, fruit of that. And, Josh mentioned just recently we've had Stephen going off to Edinburgh and Andrew going down to Kilmores, and different people going to different places. And there is, there's just something, encouraging about that, and being reminded of it. And the other thing, Josh mentioned, which, he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if in 10 years' time, everyone in our church family could think of one person who they know who's come to faith. And you sort of think, well, if that happens, then in 10 years' time, the numbers will have doubled. And when you think of it in terms of, oh, could we double our numbers in 10 years? It maybe thinks, oh, that's quite big. But when it's one person that if you bring them to the life course and bring them along to church, it's an exciting thought and it's an exciting thing to be a part of. And um, as you've said, yes, we trust the Lord and all of that, and we're not presuming that we're going to be the ones that are making that happen, but it's a privilege to be a part of that. Um, I wondered, Willie, you touched on everything that's been going on in GAFCON in recent weeks, and I wondered if maybe that maybe slightly relates to some of what you're speaking about in James, and this whole idea of allying yourself or sidling up to those who blaspheme the honourable name. And certainly we've seen some of that in the Church of Scotland in the last decade or two, and the Church of England as well. Why do you think that's such a temptation for the church to do that? It seems, the way you stated it last night, the way it's written in James, it seems so perverse. Why would you possibly, ally yourself with them when they hate the gospel? But it happens time and again. So why is it a temptation, and why is it wrong? Why is it wrong thinking to do that?
Well, we deceive ourselves easily, don't we? That's James's point. So I don't think people are consciously saying, "Oh, let's go and ally ourselves with those who are against the gospel." And James's point is saying, you don't think you're doing that, but that is what you're doing, and that's why he's challenging. And I think that does challenge us in many, many ways. I mean, I gave a few examples, but church groupings or denominations can just become wrong in their thinking, confused, and think, to make an impact on society, you have to sort of get into the club and be at the table and all of that sort of thing. Again, that can be very, very subtle often, and it comes from a desire to say, well, we want to see progress, we want to see the gospel, but the naivety is in not seeing that enemies of the gospel are not going to help you; they're going to use you, and we just fall for that in all kinds of ways, don't we? And it's a very convenient excuse, because, I mean, our folks who are involved in the Brefos ministry, for example, abortion, those who go and are trying to get other churches to be interested and involved in these things find it very, very difficult. They find it difficult among evangelical churches, and one of the reasons is often either explicitly said or just not really said, is that, well, we want to focus on the gospel, so we'll leave these sorts of things aside because that's getting a bit political, or it's getting too difficult, or whatever it is. We just want to focus on the gospel. But you can say that about so many things. Well, we won't touch abortion then, or we're not going to touch euthanasia, or we don't get involved in LGBT, or we don't get involved in, pushing back on oppression of other kinds, or a totalitarian government, or whatever. I mean, that, if you read the history of the church in Germany in the 1930s, read the biographies of Bonhoeffer and so on, and you'll find that that was very much what people were saying. The evangelical church should support Hitler because it'll give us a great platform for the gospel for people. And even other, some of the people whose names we know as sort of heroic, Martin Niemöller and so on, they were taken in by that for a long time. Well, we can see all of that and say, oh my goodness, how terrible, we would never do that. But we need to be careful. If we say, well, we won't talk about this or that, or this or that, or the other thing, or get involved in this or that or the other, because we want to get an opening for the gospel, we have to then ask the question as well, what kind of gospel is it that we're actually proclaiming? If it's one that doesn't have any impact on this or that or that or that or that or that, all these other areas of life and society, if it doesn't have any scandalous impact on the real world, well, what actual gospel is this we're speaking about? Are we evacuating the gospel of everything that actually makes it a gospel? Because the gospel is a command to repent. And the command to repent is a command to turn around, to stop going in that way, which is a rebellion against God and a scorn for his word, and turn this other way. And James is the heart of what he's putting his finger on is this double-mindedness or double-souledness or divided heart. I said one scholar translates it as that distinction or that dividedness as facing both ways. And that is the thing that Jesus says you cannot do. You can't be repenting and turning and at the same time not turning and going the same way. That's what Jesus means when he says you cannot serve God and mammon. He's not saying it's really difficult. He's saying it is not possible because God is in the east and mammon is in the west. Or God is in the north and mammon is in the south. You cannot go north and south at the same time. No matter how clever with words you are, there is no third way between north and south. It's north or south. And you can't be facing both ways. And so the gospel that saves you, and this is James's big point, is not the gospel that says, Lord, Lord, and will not think about any of these other things. It's the gospel that says, Lord, Lord, and does the will of my Father in heaven. So it can't be the gospel that says, yes, we believe in and we trust Jesus, but we're not going to talk about that because it might upset people. It's the gospel that says, well, God says that, so if this is his gospel, you have to talk about that and you have to do that. So, James's talk here about the worldly view of success, you'll want that in your church, but you won't want what the world despises. Well, substitute that for the child in the womb, for example, or the unwanted old person, or the whatever it is. The gospel has an impact in the real world, in behavior. And James's whole point is that show me your behavior and I'll tell you what your real belief is. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And so that's where we have to challenge ourselves. Whenever we're saying, well, we want to avoid this for the sake of the gospel. And you say, well, hang on, what does the gospel demand in terms of that particular thing? And can we just dispense with it and not talk about it or not deal with it? And in fact, what James is saying, what all the other apostles are saying, is that there's a behavior that goes with this belief. There's a family code for these family people. And we have to display that. And we have to display it consistently throughout all of life, talking about it, but doing it.
It's hard because it's not going to win you any popularity contests. It's, certainly not in the world. You're going to, be less popular. And I think it's, again, just thinking on the, where do we see ourselves in 10 years' time? I think there's been times at the onboard course, you've said, if someone's asked that question, you've said, well, we're probably going to be persecuted more than we are now, or they'll be less popular now then than we are even now.
I say very clearly to people, look, if you find yourself uncomfortable and squirming at some of the things you hear from the pulpit here, then don't join the church thinking that will get easier, because it won't. It'll get harder because the world is moving further and further. Well, our society here is moving further and further and further away from the truth of God and the standard of God. And if we're going to stay exactly where we are, then we are going to be more and seen as more and more extremist. You sometimes see these political cartoons now that show the spectrum of where people were, and the middle of the road person 5 years ago is now a right-wing extremist. And that's the way that our society is going. And so, we just staying where you are on the biblical perpendicular is going to put you increasingly beyond the pale. That's not really new. I mean, that's what the writer is saying in Hebrews when he says that, Christ suffered outside the camp and we go to him outside the camp. You can't be with Jesus inside the camp. These are all just different ways, different expressions, aren't they, of saying the same thing. That if you're with Jesus, you're on the road to the cross. You're not on the road to glory any other way. You're outside the camp to be with him, not inside. And
I guess the encouragement, though, is that that's the road to the great vision, which we were speaking about at the start, is that
absolutely,
as you quoted Philippians 2, Jesus, endured death, even it was obedient
Yeah.
even to death on the cross, and therefore God has exalted him to the highest place. And that's the same pattern which we're following in.
And he displayed his glory, the glory of God on earth in that. It's not that he went through all of that and then was glorified. It's that is the supreme expression of the glory of the God who serves, hated by the world, but saving the world. And so the church, throughout history, it has been the blood of the martyrs has been the seed of the church, very literally in many cases, but always it's been where the church has been not in with the world, but outside, that has had greatest impact on the world. And we mustn't fear that. He was 13. He says, he'll never. He said, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." So you can say, well, what can man do to me? The only thing that the world can do to you is take away your reputation, can take away your wealth, can take away your comforts, all of these sorts of things. Can't take away what matters. They can take away your life, sort of, for a short time. But he who loses his life for my sake will gain it, says Jesus. So it's a radical call. There's no way around that. And that has been harder for generations in this country to understand because of, I suppose, in one sense, the benefits of cultural Christianity. That's been stripped away, and we're just in situations that are more and more like the norm for the Christian church throughout history and still throughout the world today. And it's just a reversion to normal Christianity. And we have to get real about that. And that's where, connections with people in other parts of the world is so important. Every year when I come back from India, I come back with my mind realigned as to what normal Christianity is. Others experience that too, where they go to other places, and that's one of the benefits of our kind of communications in today's world, that we can have those relationships with people in very different settings from ours, but it's very necessary to remind us of that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, I think we'll stop there. But thank you for that, Willie. And next week, I think Josh is going to be finishing off with the last few verses of Luke's Gospel, and you're back in James again. Is that right? On to the next.
We are, yeah. Back to the second half of the section that we were on in chapter 2, yeah, which deals a lot with some things that people get very confused about, with the place of the law of God in the life of the Christians. So I'm going to try and hopefully straighten out some of those things that people might be a bit confused about.
Good. Well, it might help folks to read that ahead of Sunday then. But thank you for listening, and hope you listen again next week.